Hello out there. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Carson and I really love horror fiction. And for those of you that do, welcome back to the channel. Now, this is only the second horror book review that I've done on this channel, and I did consider waiting until a little bit closer to Halloween to discuss this one, but I simply could not wait any longer. I did actually read it back in the spring of this year, 2023, and it just felt like the time was now to talk about this book. And that book is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. It is impossible for me to start discussing this book without giving a little bit of context as to why I even read this book in the first place. And I do kind of want to do that with all of my reviews. Why did I pick this specific book? What were the circumstances that led me to read whatever book I will be reviewing? Now, without diving too far into this, because again, some of this you will probably be hearing a lot more about towards the end of the year when I reflect on all of the books that I've read. Again, I read a lot more than just fiction, but at the end of the year, I want to recap everything that I've read in 2023. And in this year, 2023, I've been on a bit of a journey throughout the Stephen King literary universe. Anybody that has ever read any of his books know what I'm talking about. There are quite a few that are connected either in really big ways or just passing mentions of events or characters from other books. And Salem's Lot was one that I had to read according to a list I found that tied into a bigger story at large. Again, more on that later. You might notice some things. Again, we'll get to that. I do not have time to get into that today. But regardless, this was one of the books that I needed to read as a part of the universe as a whole. A little background information on the book. This was Stephen King's second published novel, which I think is really neat. It's cool to go back and look at some of his earlier work. I haven't read Carrie. I do believe that was the first one that he published. Haven't read that one yet, but I will probably get around to it. I have been deep into a Stephen King kick lately, so I'm sure at some point I might read that one. I think this is also one of his most popular and well-known books. It has actually been adapted a couple times for the screen. There was a mini-series in the late 70s, and then in 2004, I believe they did it again as a mini-series starring Rob Lowe. I just want to be clear, I have not seen any of the adaptations of Salem's Lot. I knew a little bit about it going into it. The only thing I've ever heard about the miniseries, my parents watched the one from the 70s and they said it was awful. I don't know, maybe people out there love it, but they didn't really enjoy it very much at all. And actually, according to what I looked up about this, because of the cover of my book, there is another adaptation as a movie, I believe, currently in production. When you go to the IMDb page for it, that's all it says. There is no release date or anything, but it's a little weird because the cover of mine is a promotional picture, sorry for the glare there, a promotional picture from whatever this upcoming adaptation is, but it says now a major motion picture, but no such movie has yet materialized. I don't know if it's been scrapped. I don't know if this was the victim of COVID. I didn't look too much into it. I just think it's funny that I happened to pick up the copy that has a promotional thing, like announcing a movie that doesn't actually exist right now. I'm ready to jump into the meat of the review here, but before I do, I will say again, just like I did in my last review, this first part is going to be kind of like a vague synopsis of events, no overt spoilers. I will put up a warning in the second part or the end part of this video, letting you know when the spoilers are about to begin, because there are a few specific things that I do want to touch on for those of you that may be familiar with the book, or those of you that just want to know spoilers, that's fine. But in this section, I'm not going to give away anything that you can't read on the back cover of the book. So what is the premise of Salem's Lot? So we meet Ben Mears, who is returning to the title of the book, Salem's Lot, the town, in pursuit of writing another book. He is an author, which is something that I think is really funny about a lot of Stephen King books. It's like, quick, spot the Stephen King character. P.S. It's probably the writer. But I digress. Ben has returned not only to write, hopefully, another successful novel, as he hasn't been quite so successful recently, but he wants to draw inspiration on a specific place from Salem's Lot that deeply affected him as a young boy. So that's when we're introduced to the Marston house the stuff of legends. Every town, I think, has that creepy house with the urban legend about a monster or a witch or something that might live in it. Well, the Marston house is that for Salem's Lot. And when he was younger, Ben had an experience in there that he has not been able to shake. In pursuit of his work on this book and coming back to Salem's Lot, of course, he meets and encounters lots of different characters throughout, and then things take a turn south. Children start disappearing, weird things start happening, and it is very, very clear that something is wrong in Salem's Lot. At the same time that this is going on, a mysterious new stranger has arrived in town, Mr. Straker. Now, this is the kind of book that I love, like coming back to a place from your childhood. Mysterious new people appear, and then of course things take a turn for the worst. I absolutely love it, and I was very quickly sold on the premise of this book. And unfortunately, that's really all the synopsis I can give without giving too much of the book away. And I certainly don't want to do that for anyone that has not read it. So now that you know the loose premise of it, I want to talk about the structure of the book. I was really, really, really drawn into the writing style of it. And this is something that I've noticed in a lot of the King books that I have read already. It's like you'll have a chapter, but within that chapter, there's little sub-chapters, and some of them are very short. Sometimes in his books, each of these one of these sub-chapters might be just simply a line. And it gives you little snippets, episodic in nature, about different things that are going on in this town in Salem's Lot, like little snapshots of day-to-day life and what that looks like for different people. Because of the way it's written, and you know, like when you read a book, you do kind of have that mental image in your mind, but this writing style makes you feel like you're watching it unfold, like you're peeking into the windows of the residents of Salem's Lot's lives. And sometimes you see horrifying things. It's really kind of jarring to jump from, you know, a house where everything's perfectly fine to another house where there's like actual horrors going on. I can't really say too much. Again, I don't want to spoil it, but it does feel like snapshots and almost like you're looking in on something that maybe you shouldn't even be seeing. This book also gives you a chance to see the events from different characters' perspectives. Different chapters will be different perspectives. Like, for example, the main character, Ben, you see his perspective a lot, and there's different chapters like Ben 1 or Ben 2. You kind of hop back and forth between people's perspectives. And in this nature, the town itself, Salem's Lot, is almost like its own character. And I loved that about the book. It felt like Salem's Lot was this living, breathing entity in and of itself. That episodic nature and the town kind of feeling like its own character really reminded me of another book that I read. Not this year, I read this one a couple of years ago by Peter Straub called Ghost Story. And I think this is really funny because Stephen King and Peter Straub actually collaborated on at least 2 books that I know of. Those might be the only 2, but they wrote 2 books together. And I think their writing styles work so well together. Ghost Story by Peter Straub is similar to Salem's Lot in the way that you've got something going on in this town. You get different characters' perspectives on it, and the town itself feels like a living, breathing thing. I would like to do a proper sit-down analysis of Ghost Story at some point, but I did want to mention that these books, I call them like cousins. That's really the only way that I can draw that comparison between the 2. These books feel so related and so similar in that way, and I think that's really neat that these books that were written before they collaborated together feel so similar in tone. It just makes sense that they did eventually work on 2 books together. Another thing typical of King's work that I really appreciated and saw working big time in this book, Salem's Lot, is his use of just such descriptive, vivid imagery. And King is like the master of this. I know people call him the master of horror. He can worm his way into your mind and make you uncomfortable with just the shortest of sentences. He just picks the right words to just put you on edge, particularly when we hear about the Marston house, the one that's kind of like the source of the conflict within Ben and the fear within Ben. There are parts of that book describing things that are happening in that house or things that allegedly may or may not have happened in that house that were so unsettling. It just felt like your stereotypical, I don't want to say stereotypical in a bad way, but it felt like, let's say your quintessential haunted house story. And I do also have to say, that this book kind of left me with a feeling of helplessness or hopelessness. There were parts of it that just felt so bleak. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think when you're reading a horror novel of like this caliber, you do kind of expect to maybe not feel so great about what you're reading or what you're listening to. But there is such a bleakness to this book that really sits with you and it kind of gets into your gut. One thing I also wanted to touch on, because before I read this book, I had read a lot of comparisons between this book and a TV show that came out a few years ago, that show being Midnight Mass. I want to touch on this just briefly because I kept seeing it around the release of Midnight Mass. There were some people that asserted that Midnight Mass, the show done by Mike Flanagan, was just a straight up ripoff of Salem's Lot. I don't think that's true. While there are similar types of characters and similar themes at times, I think it's kind of foolish to say that it was a ripoff. Perhaps some of it was inspired directly or indirectly by Salem's Lot, but it was not a ripoff like people were trying to say. Two very different points that they're trying to make. I think Midnight Mass is an amazing, phenomenal show by Mike Flanagan. I think, to me, it was probably his best work. I really liked the themes, particularly regarding like the statement on religion in it. I thought was beautifully done. I thought it resonated so deeply with me emotionally. But I think to call it a ripoff of Salem's Lot is just like looking at both of these pieces of media on just like a base surface level. But I do think that if you like one or the other, that you would like whichever one you haven't seen. So if you've read Salem's Lot but haven't watched Midnight Mass, do it. You might notice some of the inspiration behind it, or vice versa. So unfortunately, again, I can't say too much more about what goes on in this book without giving away what exactly we're dealing with in Salem's Lot. Now, enough time has passed that I knew going into it, like what was going on and who the antagonist was, or what the antagonist was, I should say. I still don't want to spoil that for anybody that has made it this far in life without knowing. So from this point on, we will be dealing with spoilers because there are a few specific things that I do want to talk more in depth about. So if you haven't read it and you don't want to know anything else, this is your stopping point here. All right, vampires. It's vampires. I knew it was vampires getting into it, and I was still stunned, shocked, appalled by the graphic nature and just growing terror of this book. And just to touch again on the Midnight Mass thing in more detail, just because both of these pieces of media have a priest and vampires in them, do not make them the same thing. Father Paul and Father Callahan are two entirely different people dealing with entirely different things. And I'm sorry, but you can't just say that, oh, they both had vampires, so Midnight Mass ripped off Salem's Lot. No, I'm sorry, not here for it. I want to loop back again in more detail about what I said in part one about how this book felt so hopeless. You are reading and watching and seeing these people in this town get picked off one by one by these vampires. Mr. Straker, you are evil and I hate you. Some of the stuff that I read about people turning will sit with me for the rest of my life. And I mean, my God, some of the people that are getting affected by this are children. The scenes with the kid at the window, oh, I can't even really talk about some of it. It was so scary. But when even children are getting just savagely attacked by vampires, like what hope is there if like the innocents alive in this town can't even flourish and can't even thrive? Then what chance do any of us have? What point is there going on and fighting this evil? And I think the fact that Ben and Susan and several of the other characters try to band together to defeat Straker, and the fact that they just aren't able to, really like makes this book so much more of a gut punch. In a book filled with plenty of horrifying scenes to choose from as the most unsettling, there's one in particular that I wanted to talk about. There is a scene in the book where a burial has taken place, a funeral, because, you know, people are dying, people are being picked off one by one, and they don't know it's vampires yet. But one of the people that works at this graveyard cemetery as they are finishing up the burial, has the sensation that the person that is inside the casket has their eyes open and is looking at them. Like underneath the dirt, inside this casket, they are just struck with this horror and this fear, and they just know the eyes are open, they're looking at me. And then thus begins this mania of having to dig all the way down again and open up the casket to just see, to just prove they are looking at me. I know that they are. And it was so hard to continue reading that part. It was so creepy. One of the creepiest things I've read in any of the Stephen King books that I've read so far. That scene stuck with me. And again, this is a book just rife with graphic stuff in it, like the parts where people have been bitten and they're turning. God, there's like horrific instances of child abuse in this book. It is such a visceral read. And I've read some pretty harsh stuff, but again, you're just getting little snapshots, little snippets. Oh, we're going to look in this house for a little bit. Now we're going to move over here. It's the unfinished nature of some of these scenes that really does get to you. Now, that word unfinished can also be used to describe the end of this book. After this climax, after this confrontation with the vampire striker, our heroes of the book, they don't win. The town is dying. The town has been taken over. The town is undead, let's say that. Any hope remaining is gone. So Ben and the young boy Mark, they flee for a time, but they know they cannot leave things as they are in Salem's Lot. They know that eventually they're going to have to come back and finish picking off these vampires before anything else happens. And that's where we're left at the book. They're getting ready to go back. They're discussing, okay, this is where they could be hiding out. We've got to kind of like smoke them out of their hiding spots, and we've got to finish this. And the fact that you don't know at the end if they're successful. We leave them right before they're about to go back in and confront these horrors again. I think it's such a bold, strong choice to let your audience decide what you think happened. I love that. It's not like a cliffhanger in the sense of like, oh man, why didn't they show us exactly what happened? I think that sometimes what your mind imagines is a lot more effective than somebody explicitly stating for you. This was a phenomenal read. If you are a fan of horror, please pick this book up. If you have never read a Stephen King book, I think this would be a good starting point. Again, it was one of his first novels published. I think it's not an easy read as far as content, but again, because it is so episodic, it's very easy to follow. Again, there's a lot of great pausing points for you to put it down and come back to, but this is, I think, an essential read for any fan of horror. That's going to do it for this book review for me. I will definitely be back with some more horror content. Halloween Horror Nights is coming up very soon, so is Hallowscream Orlando. I will be bringing you some content from my trips to either of those. And in the meantime, I will be reading like a fiend in order to bring you guys a lot more content, a lot more book reviews. I do also want to get into some horror show, horror movie content as well. But as for right now, I'm like deep in my books phase, so you'll be seeing more of that from me. Make sure to go ahead and subscribe so you're notified whenever I do put up new content. I am also now on Instagram. You can follow me at HHN Carson. Thank you guys again so much for watching, and go pick up a good book. Go, do it now.